What happens when the individual responsible for USA basketball roster decisions is caught misrepresenting Caitlin Clark and Indiana Fever fans on her own podcast? Sue Bird appeared to believe she could openly distort the narrative without consequences. While microphones were live, she allowed guests to label Clark's fan base as toxic, nodded along in agreement, and then reinforced those claims herself. The problem for Bird was simple but critical. Everything was being recorded. Now there is direct video evidence suggesting potential bias from someone who is supposed to remain neutral when making national team decisions. The issue is no longer whether Bird crossed the line, but how long this mindset may have existed behind the scenes. Do you trust Sue Bird when it comes to selecting Team USA players? Let us know in the comments below. During the discussion, Bird stated that for a large group of people, mostly those active online, it was not enough to simply support a favorite player like Caitlin Clark or anyone else. Instead, she argued that these fans felt compelled to dismiss and disrespect every player who came before her, framing the past as inferior. When challenged, she doubled down, insisting that this portrayal was accurate. Sue Bird appeared on what initially seemed like a routine podcast episode of A Touch More with Megan Rapinoe and Katie Nolan. The atmosphere was casual, and Bird seemed comfortable, prepared to discuss women's basketball as she had many times before. No one anticipated that the conversation would soon expose her underlying views about Caitlin Clark and the millions of fans who discovered the WNBA through Clark's rise. The discussion began with familiar talking points about league growth, rising attendance, and increased visibility. Bird spoke like a seasoned ambassador, highlighting the positive impact of new viewers and expanded interest in the sport. Her delivery remained calm and professional as she acknowledged how much attention the WNBA had gained throughout the season. However, Bird then shifted tone, describing what she framed as growing pains. She suggested that some new fans had entered the sport for strange reasons and had chosen one player to fixate on. According to Bird, these fans passionately supported that player in a way that felt less like admiration and more like hostility disguised as love toward the rest of the league. She implied that this enthusiasm stood in opposition to what she believed a WNBA player should represent. At that point, Katie Nolan redirected the conversation directly toward Caitlin Clark's fan base. Nolan portrayed Clark's supporters as problematic and disrespectful, accusing them of disregarding league history and diminishing other players. The mood in the room shifted immediately, and Bird's response made her position unmistakably clear. As Nolan continued speaking, Bird repeatedly nodded in agreement. Her expressions brightened as Clark's fans were described as uninformed and dismissive of basketball history. Rather than remaining neutral, Bird appeared energized by the critique. She was not merely listening politely, she seemed fully aligned with the criticism. Bird then joined the conversation herself, stating that for many fans, especially online, supporting Caitlin Clark was not enough. She argued that these fans simultaneously felt the need to declare that every great player before Clark was irrelevant or inferior. With that statement, Bird actively participated in condemning the very audience that had brought unprecedented attention to the league. She continued by describing moments when longtime fans felt forced to remind newcomers that they had paid the same price for tickets and that their presence still mattered to the sport. Bird suggested that these newer fans lacked respect for years of ongoing conversations within women's basketball, acting as if they could rewrite the narrative simply because they supported one exceptional player. She acknowledged Clark's talent but expressed frustration that fans wanted to openly love her without recognizing the broader context of the league's history. These situations, Bird said, were moments that caused her to bristle as a women's sports fan. The contradiction becomes unavoidable when Bird's official role is considered. As the managing director of USA Basketball, she is expected to evaluate players objectively and without bias. Yet here she was, on camera, openly criticizing the fan base of the very player who brought historic attention and growth to the WNBA. Bird's body language throughout the podcast further reinforced this perspective. She leaned forward when discussing Clark's supporters, her gestures becoming more animated as her criticism intensified. These did not appear to be spontaneous remarks. Instead, they reflected thoughts she had clearly been holding onto for some time. The segment serves as visible evidence that Bird harbors resentment toward the magnitude of Clark's impact. Every nod, smile, and verbal agreement suggested someone who viewed the league's biggest breakthrough as a personal irritation rather than a triumph. Bird appeared to believe she was among sympathetic hosts, speaking freely without consequence. Instead, the cameras captured a pattern of bias from someone tasked with remaining impartial regarding Clark's international future. In response to this segment, critics noted that the conversation added nothing constructive to the growth of women's basketball. They questioned why the idea of a toxic fan base continued to be resurfaced and described the discussion as condescending, suggesting that fans supported Caitlin Clark for reasons unrelated to basketball ignored the reality of her on-court achievements. It was particularly striking that Nolan later admitted she did not watch many games, identifying herself as a casual observer who merely kept track of headlines, an admission that undercut the authority of her critique. Bird's stance becomes more revealing when examined through the lens of her basketball background. A University of Connecticut graduate who won 2 national championships, Bird's identity is deeply tied to the UConn program. That connection shapes her perspective on which players she believes deserve recognition. In the same podcast where Bird criticized Clark's fans, she passionately defended Paige Bueckers. Her tone shifted entirely, filled with advocacy and concern. Bird argued that Bueckers deserved significantly more media attention and expressed disbelief that her popularity lagged behind Clark's. She extended this sentiment to other players, suggesting that several stars were being overlooked. Bird cited statistics claiming Bueckers received only a fraction of Clark's media coverage, framing this imbalance as a serious injustice. Her frustration sounded personal, as though this was an issue she had been contemplating for some time. The contrast was striking, one segment spent undermining Clark's supporters, followed by another campaigning for a UConn product to receive equal attention. What Bird failed to acknowledge was that Clark's visibility was earned through historic performances, record-breaking seasons, and the ability to draw millions of new fans into the sport. Instead, Bird implied that media coverage should be redistributed, rather than reflecting audience interest and performance. Her argument collapses under scrutiny. On one hand, she criticized the player responsible for revitalizing the league,